The biggest challenge, I mean, every single generation has a challenge, and the way it reacts to that challenge shapes how it is remembered by future generations to come. And for all of us in this room, make no mistake, the challenge that we have to address is that of global poverty. And I think it's really important as we think about how to address global poverty that we begin with a clear definition of what we mean. So when we think of poverty, we often have statistics that come to mind. I think earlier we were talking about the base of the pyramid, and you ask, what's the number again? I said $2, right? So the poverty line used to be $1 per day. It's now been, quote unquote, upgraded to $2 per day. So if you look at most of the reports and the statistics, when we talk about the global poor, we mean people that live under $2 a day, right? I remember actually being on a taxi cab back in Kigali. That was in 2001, and there was this great guy called JP, and he's asking me, so what do you do? What are you doing here? I'm like, well, I'm here for a consulting project. He's like, you don't look like a consultant. I mean, first of all, you're African, and then you're kind of way too young. I'm like, well, that's true, but, I still hope I can be helpful. And he's like, one of the issues that I have is that people want for us, what they don't want for themselves. I'm like, JP, what do you mean? He's like, look, if, at the time it was $1 a day, it's like, if I went from 75 cents a day to $1.10, am I rich? I had to tell him no. I mean, if any of us went from $1.75 to $2.25, we wouldn't feel particularly prosperous, right? So he said, why should we be happy with just moving above $1 a day? What we are talking about here is to find a way to create prosperity. And if we are going to be able to create prosperity, we have to find ways of addressing this issue of global poverty differently than what we have done in the past. Because over the past 50 years, if you look at the track record in terms of our ability to create global prosperity, as in really lift a number of people out of poverty, it hasn't been that great. You have some sort of exceptions, but you look at a continent like Africa, it's still really the mass of people that are still struggling are actually 2/3 of the population. So the question then becomes, what do we do? I believe that to think about what we do, we have to be able to reconcile two perspectives that most people think can be reconciled. We have to be able to reconcile the fact that all of us want to do well, so profit is a good thing and we want to all make money, and find a way in the way we make money to actually lift up this base of the pyramid out of poverty into prosperity. So that's really the challenge. And to think about that, my belief is that we must start with a very, very sort of concrete perspective. And the story that really comes to mind is actually somebody that I met in Burundi a few years ago. He's actually a tea farmer there. At the time we were looking at the tea sectors, trying to think about how to turn it around. And he tells me this story about his crops and what he's doing, and we start talking, and he's like, look, I have to tell you, things have become so hard that we are now reduced to a perspective where we have to use those bouillon cubes. You all know those Maggi bouillon cubes that everybody uses. I have to use those in my stews so that my kids can remember the taste of meat. To me, that level of poverty is really what we have to figure out a way of addressing. So if you look at people like him, it tells you a story of his commodity prices actually crashing. And the result it has on him, he can't put his kids through school, and things are very, very difficult. And he tells you how he has to work extremely hard and every day without necessarily being able to make his ends meet. And he has to actually depend on some sort of assistance from siblings in the capital cities to actually do well. So if you look at the story of Simon, which is actually the story of about 2/3 of people that live in developing countries, you have that sense of, I don't know where my next meal is going to come from. It's really a day-to-day struggle. Then you think, look, it's only him, he's actually poor, you have people in societies that are doing much, much better. Well, let's think about it more carefully. You think about the entrepreneurs that you have. you find that those entrepreneurs, even when they are able to sell, I mean, how many people here have made investments in developing countries? Raise your hands. How easy or difficult is it after you've made that first decision to actually execute your investment? Is it easy? Is it difficult? Difficult, yeah? You find that in certain cases, people say, oh my God, all you have to do is have a great product and then you sell. Well, even when you sell, people are not paying you. Let's say, for example, you're actually selling to the government. It's difficult. You're looking for staff. The quality of the staff is not there. You're looking at infrastructure. You have issues. You find that business people, whether they're entrepreneurs or head of corporates, are also having all sorts of challenges that they have to sort of deal with. If you go further and you look at sort of the government leaders, a lot of them have the trappings of power, sort of big cars and bodyguards and etc. And you think about the budget of any developing country, a lot of it is really based on aid. So you have leaders that are elected to actually change the lives of the people, quote unquote, that don't have the resources to make that happen, right? You push further to development partners. I remember being at a meeting when we were talking to some of the development partners, and just a group like USAID will spend about $23 billion every year. That's the budget. It's only them. I mean, you have the World Bank, and I mean, you actually, it probably in the hundreds of billions. And conversation is about how do we increase that to at least 0.7% of the GNP of developing countries. But even then, there is nothing to show for it. So what actually occurred to me and what came out very, very clearly is that all these stakeholders, although the circumstances may look like they are different, they are all actually stuck in one reality. And that reality, I call it the survival trap, right? The survival trap is this vicious cycle where you have to work extremely hard, pedal even faster just to stay in the same place. How does it work? Well, you actually start with the operating reality. So you live in an environment where things are just hard. Infrastructure doesn't work, you have issues of corruption, issues of security, you have, poverty. So that particular operating reality, which is your environment, creates a mindset that's reactive. If you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, it's very difficult for you to begin trusting. It's very difficult for you to look at things very, very fast. So you develop a reactive mindset, which means that most of the actions that people take are actions that are likely to be to deal with symptoms as opposed to addressing some of the root causes. In terms of results, you may get some short-term benefit, but the operating reality that you started with doesn't quite change, and then you do this again and again, right? I think it's Einstein that said that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, right? So if that survival trap is there, how do we make sure we actually get out of it? Because to me, that's really the challenge. If we're going to find a way to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunities that are in developing countries, while at the same time creating opportunities for the 4 billion people that live under the poverty line, we have to get out of this survival trap. So how do we do it? I think the first thing that we have to do, we have to make sure that we actually identify the reason why that survival trap is so strong. I believe that there are actually 5 gaps that make that survival trap very, very strong. Let me explain what they are. The first gap is around trust. The first gap is around trust. When you are in an environment where, again, you have many challenges, it's very, very difficult to trust other people. I mean, if the level of corruption, the institutions, etc. don't work, the chances that you're actually going to trust people actually, the likelihood of trust actually goes down. The second thing is this notion of equity. So again, if I'm in an environment where things are difficult, I'm likely to have a zero-sum mindset. What this means is, I think if you do well, I must be doing poorly. So imagine that you have invested in my business, and I'm looking at returns that I have to pay to you, and in my mind I'm thinking, oh my God, it's taking away all the work from me. What's the likelihood that your investment is going to work, right? That's something that's important. You think about the planning horizon, everything becomes short-term because you have to address the problems that are there today as opposed to thinking about what will happen 5 years from now. You also look to really avoid risk as opposed to taking risk because you think there will be a reward. And you become defensive. So you find someone to blame for all the problems that are there. What really becomes difficult is when those 5 gaps work together, which is the case in most base of the pyramid market. Because when those 5 gaps work together, it becomes very, very difficult for people to prosper and do well. So how do we get out of it? How do we address those gaps and how do we get out of the social trap? I believe the first thing that we have to do is to recognize the opportunity that there is in base of the pyramid market. And I think the best way to look at that is to think about the growth rates that you're looking at. If you look at Africa, looking at 4.9%, over the period of 2000 to 2008, Asia is actually 8%. It's even higher. So there is a lot of growth. And you look at the continent of Africa in particular, the trajectory that people have seen is actually very, very good, but it is actually forecasted. There is a report that was done by the McKinsey Global Institute called Lions on the Move, where they tell you that you should look at a combined GDP of about $2.6 trillion for Africa by the year 2020. So that's actually quite a bit that you will see there. If you look at the study done by The Economist in 2011, 6 out of the 12 fastest growing countries in the world are in Africa. And the other ones are also in sort of bottom of the pyramid market. So there is actually quite a bit of growth there. The other thing is that if you look at the level of entrepreneurship, it's actually quite high. I mean, this is a statistic that most people are not aware of. It actually measures what they call the total entrepreneurial activity. What it is, to be specific, is the share of your GDP that is accounted for by businesses that are less than 3 years old, right? If you look at the statistics, actually you're looking at 19.2% for South America, looking at 15.6% for Africa, which is actually much higher than North America and Europe. So there is quite a bit there by way of entrepreneurship. But people will say, yes, but if you look at the type of entrepreneurship you have on the continent, it's not necessarily the type that is really changing societies. A lot of people just go into business because they don't have a choice. And I think that's absolutely true. And a number of those business people are actually what I might call survival business people, i.e., I have nothing else to do. The only way I can eat is if I start a business. But I think there is a new class of entrepreneurs, which is actually, to me, the most exciting thing, that are actually defying that trend.